Sometimes it's not just a demand for payment. It may well be that actually when they have to give over their documents to be processed and photocopied, often, the guy will put it back in his pocket and say, well, actually, if you want it back, then you need to pay, or you need to accept this lower salary in order for us not to damage your documents before they're returned to you. So there are very crafty ways in which recruitment agents are operating.
Hi there, and welcome to Voices from the Institute for Human Rights and Business, also known as IHRB. I am Deborah Sago, and in this podcast, you'll hear from people working to make respect for human rights part of everyday business. You just heard from Ben Bailey, who is Director of Program at Mission to Seafarers, a charity that supports people working in the seafaring industry. Ben's talking about recruitment fees, which is a huge issue for workers in shipping. My colleague Francesca Fairbairn has been looking into this. She spoke to Ben and to Reverend Stephen Thanapaul, who runs operations for Mission to Seafarers in South India. Francesca, can you tell us about some of the challenges facing seafarers, like recruitment fees?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Deborah. I mean, seafarers face all the usual labour rights risks that land-based workers and migrant workers face in terms of representation, job security, all those kind of things. But they also face a number of human rights risks, if you like, that are exclusive to their line of work. So one of those would be a risk of pirate attacks, which we've seen a lot of in the last sort of 2-3 years, particularly around the Red Sea. Another is the possibility of abandonment, where a ship owner stops paying wages or providing food or water to a ship that they own, and seafarers are left floating offshore and possibly in an anchorage many miles from shore and not wanting to leave the vessel because they think that means that they won't get their back pay. Criminalization is another area that affects seafarers very particularly, where they're scapegoated for crimes or accidents that happen to happen on their watch on their ships. So, for example, if they discover drugs on board their ships, they can be arrested and imprisoned, and this has happened, or if their ship is involved in a collision, for example, as happened in Baltimore last year, where those seafarers were imprisoned for a time. Lack of shore leave is another area. And in fact, I heard during London International Shipping Week that 25% of seafarers had no shore leave on their most recent contract. And if your contract is 9 months or 11 months, that is a long time not to be able to get off and on shore. And then, as you mentioned, they're also vulnerable to exploitation through the illegal charging of recruitment fees. And that's not exclusive to seafarers, of course, but it's a huge problem. And research that we've done 2 big research projects on this, and both have shown very clearly that up to a third of seafarers are asked to pay fees, sometimes huge fees. And they often borrow heavily in order to pay for these, resulting in a considerable debt burden, and then there's all the associated stress and mental health implications of that.
So, why did you want to speak to Ben and Father Stephen?
Well, it's World Maritime Day, and Mission to Seafarers is among the oldest maritime charities. I mean, they've all been around for years. Shipping's a very, very old profession. But Mission to Seafarers has been supporting seafarers and their families since 1856, both on the ground and in terms of advocacy, so standing up for their rights, fighting for their rights, if you like, among the industry. And Mission to Seafarers are seeing an increase, huge increase in issues like abandonment and recruitment fees.
Thanks, Francesca. Let's hear your conversation with Ben and Father Stephen now.
From an advocacy perspective, I suppose there are 3 main issues that the Mission to Seafarers gets involved with and has some real concerns about. The first one is the shocking number of abandonments that are happening increasingly around the world. At the moment, the ILO is reporting over 178 cases of abandonment, and I know that there are other organisations that perhaps have higher figures within their own internal data. But there does seem to have been a significant shift in abandonment since the end of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is leaving seafarers without food, without water, without wages, without any means of repatriation. I spend a lot of my time in the UAE, where we're dealing almost exclusively with that type of issue on a daily basis, and I'm sure we might come on to that. Another issue that particularly is pertinent with seafarers from India is the issue of recruitment fees. We're seeing huge numbers of seafarers that are being extorted by rogue recruitment agents, by shipping companies that are putting in place hidden fees, or indeed requiring seafarers to do pretty horrific scenarios and find themselves in pretty difficult situations that they have no option if they want that job other than to take part in, which is really not only demeaning the human nature and the dignity of the seafarers, but is an absolute illegal practice that must be stopped. And the other issue that we're really worried about is shore leave. Again, since the pandemic, unfortunately, it is not returning on the level that it needs to be. And of course, the impact of shore leave is that it has a fundamental role with the safety of shipping, and we need to ensure that shore leave is returning. So there are a whole other range of issues that are affecting seafarers, but those particularly are the most important that we see that need to be addressed by industry and the international community.
So, in terms of recruitment fees, have you come across any examples of good practice in terms of how to prevent the charging of recruitment fees, how to educate seafarers in looking for work where recruitment fees aren't charged, for example?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head in terms of education. And unfortunately, sort of what good looks like is not a message that potentially the industry or wider stakeholders are talking to seafarers about often enough. Certainly there are many good and regulated shipping companies that have, long-standing arrangements with manning agents. Many of those agents will be part of the company's wider group of companies, and so they are much better regulated. There is a lot of protection for the seafarers. But of course, there are large parts of the industry where seafarers have to go through independent and private manning agents, and that is where the subjection to recruitment fees often happens. And sometimes it's not just, a demand for payment. It may well be that actually when they have to give over their documents for their documents to be processed and photocopied, often, the guy will put it back in his pocket and say, well, actually, if you want it back, then you need to pay, or you need to accept this lower salary in order for us not to damage your documents before they're returned to you. So there are very crafty ways in which recruitment agents are operating. And I think because of the desperation that there is for people to want to go to sea because they know that they can earn more than they can when they're at home, means that seafarers are willing to take a risk and that they're prepared to potentially get rid of some of their own rights in return for paid because they're in such a desperate need to support their families. And so we've got to do more to educate seafarers about what good looks like. And we've also got to ensure that there is better regulation so that these types of agencies are being shut down by governments and that they're being outlawed.
I mean, I think from speaking to some ship operators and reputable ship operators, ship owners, ship managers, and also some civil society people, there is a lack of awareness in the industry of how widespread and problematic the issue of recruitment fees is. And I think in terms of seafarers themselves, certainly looking at India, and again, I'll probably come on to this with you, Father Stephen, in a minute, is recruitment is beginning to happen from tier 2 and 3 cities in India, which are inland, where they have less connection with the sea and therefore even less education and awareness of what their rights are in terms of things like the Maritime Labour Convention, which used to be there explicitly prohibits the charging of recruitment fees for a job at sea. In terms of abandonment, what do you think that companies can do? Because that is a harder one because it's invisible, right? Because it's happened before they go on ships, that you can be on a legitimate, reputable ship and you can have paid recruitment fees way back down the line. But with abandonment, it is the rogue operators. So it's not the big global companies that are abandoning ships, is it? So what can companies do you think?
I mean, you're right to say that it's not the main companies, but I think it's worth saying that abandonments can happen because a company might naturally fail because of whatever bad decisions that management has taken. And of course, those abandonments are terrible in the same way that it would be on land if a factory was suddenly closing or a company was going under. And of course, events do happen. And of course, it's very traumatic for the seafarers. I think when I talk about abandonment and from our experience of abandonment, we're talking about persistent rogue operators who deliberately intend and choose to abandon their vessels because it's good for business, because it means from their perspective they don't have to pay out quite so much. They might be flagging to states which don't have regulatory enforcement. They might only be operating in countries where perhaps the inspections aren't quite as thorough, or perhaps they're not even looking to ensure that the people working on board have been paid and are being properly treated. And of course, those seafarers are absolutely left abandoned, and many of them are actually left in anchorages, so they're not even close enough to the shoreline to be able to get help when they need it. And just in the last few weeks, I've been working on a number of vessels where seafarers have not been paid for upwards of 6 months, which is well beyond the minimum amount that is set under the abandonment legislation within the Maritime Labour Convention. They had no food, they had no water, they had no oil on board to be able to run the generator, and this is happening in parts of the Gulf where, it's been 48 to 50 degrees over the summer. And so it's not just a human rights issue, it's also impacting on the safety and the environment. It is also impacting on the families. And so I think it's not so much about what those shipping companies can do, because they are persistent abusers of this situation. And so they're always going to try and do it if they can find a way to get away with it. From my perspective, we need to see much tougher regulation from flag states. And if you are one of these organizations and ship owners who repeatedly abandon your ships, then actually there should be no flag state in the entire world that would be prepared to give you access to its registry. And until we see that type of scenario being played out, and so for that we need the ILO, we particularly need the IMO to be involved, then I'm afraid we're going to regularly see the abandonments ticking up.
Perhaps then abandonment in particular is an issue where the industry really needs to come together to kind of lobby flag states, perhaps vote with their feet, not flag their ships in registries where abandoned ships are flagged to also.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of my absolute frustrations when I am in places like the IMO, sitting on the sidelines, listening to debate, is that, the evidence will be presented in front of maybe the legal committee, maybe the Maritime Safety Committee. And rather than all of the flag states, the member states turn around and say, actually, this is absolutely shocking, one by one, often will stand up and say, oh, but actually you've logged this as an abandonment, but it's not really an abandonment. And they start to become mealy-mouthed. They start to become defensive of the people that are owning vessels that are under their registries. And that's not right. Morally and just fundamentally, it is wrong. And so if the international regulatory community is serious about stamping out abandonments, which according to every press release, according to every reception that they have, it's high on their list, that they want to deal with it, then actually they've got to take tough enforcement action. And the only way they can do that is by giving the IMO stronger teeth to actively ban the operation of these registries.
That's very interesting. Thanks, Ben. If I can move over to Father Stephen now. So, as I mentioned before, you run Mission to Seafarers South India operations, I think focusing on Tamil Nadu. And I think you're based in Tuticorin. Perhaps you could just give us a little bit of a flavor of what your work involves.
Yes, we are working in Tuticorin, Tamil Nadu in South India. First of all, I'm very happy to share about the Tuticorin Seafarers Center, which provides all support and welfare issues, meeting the welfare issues of the seafarers. We work with two major works we participate in. First one is regular ship visits are being done every day with the help of the port authorities who have given a port entry pass. During the ship visit, we welcome seafarers to the port, listening to their different stories to help them whatever and whenever. We do counseling on board also, giving emotional support to them. Sometimes they do not have some medical tablets or medical items. We have a center in Tuticorin where we have all the facilities for seafarers. It's one of the biggest center here in India. So we provide free Wi-Fi system for the seafarers, and we have some recreational items for them, indoor games, and we have a shop in the center. We also provide free transportation because the port is 7 kilometers away from the center. So every day we go to the port and we meet the people. And if they are willing to, the seafarers are willing to come outside the port. So we bring them to our center and we make them relax over there. And if they want to go to some shopping malls, we take them and we encourage them to have some Indian food in the hotels or wherever they want to have.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said about taking seafarers into the port, because often now these big new ports are a long way from the cities that they serve. And so whereas in the past, being a seafarer, you were delivered into the center of a city and so you could go out and explore. Now, with, as Ben said, this reduction in shore leave, your opportunity of going into town is doubly curtailed from the sheer distance from the town, as well as the lack of time you have in getting there. Also, I think some ports charge transportation fees and all that. And so therefore, this kind of on-the-ground support that you talk about in Tuticorin is so vital for these seafarers. And it's repeated and reflected in, I think it's 200 other ports or over 200 other ports that you do. And I hope that companies contribute generously to Mission to Seafarers, because you provide a service that these companies arguably should be providing themselves, and if not, should be very grateful to Mission to Seafarers for providing, because they essentially, what you're doing, in my view, is making life at sea bearable. And given the sort of lovely things that you provide in Tuticorin, for example, not only bearable, but fun on the off time. And, you know, for a career that can be very isolating, when you can spend 9 months on board a ship where you're perhaps the only person of your nationality on board that ship, working very hard, that kind of social interaction is critical for the mental health, I think, of seafarers, which, of course, as we know, is a really big issue. And perhaps, Ben, you could just talk a little bit about living works.
Yeah, absolutely. So I said at the beginning, one of the training courses that we have started to provide is called Safe Talk, which is a suicide awareness program. And we are increasingly now training both shoreside staff, but increasingly and seafarers themselves to be able to spot the signs of their colleagues and their friends who may be at risk of suicide. We're only just as an industry in a situation where we're beginning to get data about the number of people who die at sea. For many, many years, the industry could always tell you how many containers had fallen into the sea, but they could never tell you how many people had died, either through accident, natural causes, or indeed intentionally by their own hand. But there has been a rise. You know, we saw that at the beginning of COVID, and I think it's because of the real isolation and just the sheer alienation of being a seafarer, that seafarers do seem to be more prone to suicide. And so this whole course is intended to get seafarers and others to spot signs of potential vulnerable individuals, to keep them safe for a short period of time, until such time as you can actually get more competent professional medical, psychological, clinical support, whatever it might be that is needed. And so, you know, we're finding that a lot of seafarers are finding that very beneficial. Our own teams, however, are also finding it beneficial because, as Father Stephen says, when he goes on board his ships with his colleagues, actually he's able to sort of maybe spot people who might be sat on their own, a bit more isolated, not joining in, not having conversations. And that could be just because they're having a bad day or they don't want to take part, but there may also be something more fundamental happening underneath. And so it gives him then a framework within which he can work to provide the support that seafarer might need.
Yeah. And I think our research on recruitment fees also has shown that the debt burden that is often involved in the usurious rates of interest and so on that come along with having to borrow money to pay these large fees, which can be anything up to and over $10,000. I mean, that's a very high end, but, you know, certainly most in the hundreds, if not thousands. But that has a very direct impact on mental health.
And absolutely, it does. And I think also you can connect that to the abandonments as well, because many of the seafarers that we support who are abandoned have paid recruitment fees, and those fees still have to be paid, even though their employer is not paying them, even though they're not getting the food and water that they need and that they should be given. And all of it just combines into this pressure pot, which makes it completely intolerable. And so, definitely, we have seen, unfortunately, some seafarers have chosen suicide as their way out because they feel that it's their only option, which of course it's not, and we try and support them as best we can. But you can understand that when everything else around you is falling apart and that pressure point is still there, and the cultural shame that might be attached to it also from your family, because they've sent you to sea and they want you to be the best that you can be, that it can just become too much for them. And so that's why we're determined and committed to supporting seafarers wherever we can.
And of course, we want ship owners, operators, charterers all to understand and to alleviate mental health problems. But if that's too kind of woolly or non-bottom line for a shipping company, then one can put the argument that there is a direct link between poor mental health and safety incidents on board ships. So therefore, that is a bottom line issue. And so they should treat it, they should provide facilities and resources for improving mental health for that reason, if for no other. So, Ben, I mean, you mentioned the impact of all this on families earlier on. Father Stephen, you've been doing some work in that area too. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
We have a newly launched a program we call Family Support Network. So which is a very great support for the seafarers, because you know that in India, South India, where I am working, every village has seafarers and fishermen also. We have identified 17 villages. So we have some programs for the women empowering, children IT skills program, and medical awareness. And especially for the International Seafarers Day, we gather all the seafarers in our center. Last year, we had 400 families and seafarers gathering together, where we give some more addresses to the family care, child care, financial support, well-being courses we have introduced to them also. And we have a Seafarers Association's representatives meeting also once in a year, where we gather all the people, share about their experiences in the mission. So this is a major work that we do as we are talking about shady recruitment. We are facing the same here also. Some of the seafarers are cheated by the company or the recruitment, some agencies also. So these are the issues that we've been challenged by that. So this mission to seafarers here, if it is not here, I would say that there would be many, seafarers, families and seafarers would not have got the opportunities to know about their families also. So we are mostly enjoying the family support network. It connects us directly with the families. We often say that seafarers are often forgotten in the sea, but in the same way, the families are in land also, because even though they live with the community, they are separated, isolated from their family, loved ones. So it's a very great opportunity to serve the seafarers' families through the family network programs.
That's great. And I think, to quote a figure that Ben has said in the past, and Ben, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but it's something like one seafarer's salary often provides livelihoods for up to 12 family members. So that is a very important salary. If we pan back out then to the advocacy perspective, in terms of companies that you think are doing good work across the board with regard to seafarers, would you call out any in particular, Ben, do you think?
I think what's really important is that we're seeing, and we have seen over certainly the last probably 20 years, a growing rise of CSR type responsibility about understanding where our products are made, where our products are coming from, etc., how they're made, what's happening in the communities where they're being manufactured. It's always been pretty easy to deal with that part of the process, because obviously those people are generally stationary, they're physically in one location, you can go and visit them, you can get a better understanding. The bit in between, how the goods get from A to B, has always been a bit tricky, because of course, when the ship is over the horizon, it essentially disappears. And so I think we are beginning to see a growing number of these companies who are starting to listen to the seafarers. They want to hear from those seafarers to understand what they know about their rights and what's happening on board, but also that they recognize that there is that sort of continuity of care, that umbrella of support doesn't just begin and end with either a maritime welfare charity or the ship's name, which is emblazoned on the side of the vessel, but also that the people carrying the cargo also have an interest and a potential responsibility. And so we do quite a bit of work with cargo owners, including IKEA now, who are really actively interested in understanding that worker voice, and to the point that they're using that to inform the kind of ships and the companies that they are chartering. They are beginning to ask questions in their business meetings and in their negotiations about actually making sure that the people on board the vessels that they're chartering are being properly paid, are being properly respected, are getting the time off that they need. And I think actually that is where the real power and the real change is going to happen within the industry, because the industry is always looking for the cheapest possible option in terms of the people that are going to work on board their ships, or the cheapest type of fuel, or the quickest route that they can get from A to B. And on the one hand, you can understand that because they're a commercial entity. And so having cargo owners come on board and actually really ask some intensive, holistic questions about what is happening to the people that is transporting our cargo is causing a real shift in dialogue within industry. And I think industry is actually beginning to think, oh, hang on a minute, we've got to take this a bit more seriously than we have. And that's not to say that every, shipping company is disregarding their crew or disrespectful of their crew, far from it. And there are plenty of shipping companies that do right by their crew for many, many years, and they have high retention rates because of it. But actually where the real shift is going to come is by those cargo owners asking those questions and making it part of their business decisions.
Thank you so much, Ben. I hope there are some cargo owners and charterers listening that might spur them into action if they're not already active in that area. Thank you both very much for talking to me today on World Maritime Day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Francesca, we heard there a little bit about what good looks like in terms of what companies are doing. What recommendations do you have for companies involved in shipping that want to respect seafarers' rights?
Well, I mean, there's lots that all kinds of players can be doing. I would say in the first instance, ship owners and operators must ensure that crew recruited through agencies are not being charged any fee beyond what is allowed under the Maritime Labour Convention, which is a medical certificate, a National Seafarers book, and a passport. And all other payments should be covered by the employer, thinking about the employer pays principle, for example. Customers of shipping companies, charterers, commodity companies and traders, container cargo owners, they must carry out due diligence on this issue with their shipping suppliers to ensure that their cargo isn't being carried by people who have had to pay extensive recruitment fees for their job. Flag state and port state authorities of countries who have ratified the Maritime Labour Convention are required to investigate any reports of the charging of recruitment fees. Home states, i.e. where seafarers come from, must ensure that the crewing agencies that operate in their countries don't charge fees for jobs, and must enact and enforce penalties for these practices. And, that can include delicensing them or even closing them down if needed. And all of the industry players I mentioned above, ship owners, operators, customers, and state authorities, they all need to ensure much, much greater awareness among seafarers of all of their rights, but particularly of the charging of recruitment fees, the fact that the charging of recruitment fees is illegal. And really, ideally, this must happen long before they board ships, where often, often it's the case that recruitment fees and equivalent costs are charged long before they end up in position.
Thanks, Francesca, and thanks to Father Stephen Thanapaul and Ben Bailey from Mission to Seafarers for that enlightening conversation. And thank you for listening to this episode of Voices, which is brought to you from the Institute for Human Rights in Business. Until next time, be sure to share and follow this podcast, that way you will never miss an episode. And if you'd like to find out more about the work that we do at IHRB, then head to ihrb.org.